So for the first time in a while, I sat down to build a new commander deck. Usually you just sort of go through the first stuff that is easy to put in, and you're like, well, these go in every commander deck, or all decks with these colors pretty much play these cards. And then you start going through and looking for kind of secondary synergies, maybe things you haven't thought about before, maybe cards that are specifically good in this particular context of the thing that you're building. As I'm doing this process, as I have many times before, I keep arriving at a similar conclusion. The graveyard is really good. Inevitably, I start thinking, okay, well, if I want all these cards in the graveyard, what is the easiest way to get them there? And this is where I always land. All roads end up leading to Dredge.
Structure makers.
Before we can get too far into why I think I end up always at Dredge, let's talk about where Dredge came from, some of its history, and sort of where it is now in the grand scheme of Magic. Dredge was introduced in the first Ravnica set, Ravnica City of Guilds. This came out in September of 2005, rotating out the infamous Mirrodin block with Ravager Affinity and famously underpowered Kamigawa. This was back when we had 3-set blocks, so the first block was 4 of the guilds, and then we were going to get 3 guilds in Guild Pact, and then 3 more in Dissension, which was the sets that were following Ravnica. Each of the guilds had a premier mechanic, and Dredge was the premier mechanic for Golgari. The card Graveshell Scarab was seeing some small amount of play in mid-range style, really grindy decks, right? It was this great blocker. It drew you a card every so often, and then with Dredge 1, it was really easy to get back without having to sacrifice much of your library. The way the Dredge works is it's a replacement effect, so whenever you would draw a card, if you have a creature with Dredge in your graveyard, you can instead dredge X, which is the number indicated on the card. So if a card says something like Dredge 6, whenever you would draw a card, instead of drawing that card, you can take 6 cards off the top of your deck and put them into your graveyard, and then take that Dredge card and put it into your hand. It seems like the design philosophy behind this was that the higher the Dredge number, the bigger the drawback for the cards. We can see this sort of design philosophy in things, the difference between a card like Graveshell Scarab and Golgari Grave Troll, or even something like Stinkweed Imp, which was a great blocker at the time, right? If you're in a limited environment where you may not have, all the tools necessary here, and you're playing Dredge in a vacuum, and you're playing a 40-card deck, dredging 5 to recur an effectively Death Touch blocker. Yes, Stinkweed Imp is before Death Touch, so it has a slightly different wording. If you're trying to recur that blocker in a limited environment, the 40-card deck, 5 cards off of your library is a substantial cost, right? You're putting them in your graveyard. In this set, you probably don't have that many things to flash back, considering you're in that limited card pool. And so I could see how if you're designing Dredge in a vacuum, you would think that the higher the number, the bigger the drawback. Ravnica comes out with Dredge sort of not seeing a whole lot of fanfare. There was a little bit of it being played in a few decks, but we didn't really get to see the potential of the Dredge mechanic until a bit later, when it gets sort of introduced into the wider card pool of formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. These environments have a lot more powerful cards that can utilize the graveyard in much more sophisticated ways. Some cards in particular that really enable this strategy with things like Bridge from Below, which is printed in Future Sight. Over time, Dredge decks became mainstays in Eternal formats with cards like Prized Amalgam, Creeping Chill in Modern, Bridge from Below and Breakthrough in Legacy, and Bazaar of Baghdad and Serum Powder in Vintage. The power of these Dredge decks became so obvious at one point in time that this sort of created what we refer to as the Dredge cycle, where the amount of Dredge decks in the format had such a huge impact on the metagame that players would have to tailor their sideboards in order to make sure that they had the correct amount of graveyard hate to stop Dredge decks from just running over them, because these decks are so powerful without any kind of cards that counter their strategies. If you weren't playing 4 copies of Leyline of the Void in your sideboard, and Dredge was very popular in the metagame, you were likely to just get run over without being able to basically play a game of Magic. That's how powerful the Dredge mechanic becomes when the deck is tuned properly to utilize this ability. So the Dredge cycle became there's a large number of Dredge decks in the format. People would put more and more graveyard hate into their sideboards, which would then make it so Dredge decks effectively couldn't win the game, because the saturation of graveyard hate was so massive that these decks would fold to it and effectively not be able to win. And so the Dredge decks would then stop being played because they're there's no way for them to actually win the game, or at least not regularly enough for them to be a contender. Then, after the dredge decks disappear, over time, those sideboard slots start to be utilized for against other types of strategies. So the graveyard hate comes out of the sideboards, and now we end up in this stage where nobody's really playing dredge, but there's not a lot of hate cards and sideboards anymore to deal with dredge. So inevitably, dredge starts to come back up, and so people start playing dredge again. People then eventually start playing graveyard hate in their sideboards again, and then the cycle continues. In classical 60-card constructed formats, dredge is still around today. You see it mostly in Legacy and Vintage, where it has a dedicated player base who really enjoys these strategies, me being one of them. And the decks continue to be iterated on as new tools come out for the deck to have another chance to succeed. With the power of dredge decks in classic Magic, being so evident, we can look to something like the Storm scale. This is the scale that Mark Rosewater uses to basically to rank mechanics for their likelihood of being reprinted. They're on a scale from basically 1 being the most likely to be reprinted to 10, which is the least likely. The scale being named after the Storm mechanic, which is obviously a 10 and much less and very unlikely to make much of a comeback. And dredge on the scale is also a 10, that it is less likely to return than mechanics like Annihilator, Attractions, and Companions. Before we get into the commander side of things, I just wanted to preface this all with, this is probably not the kind of strategy that you would want to be using in lower bracket games. So with all that being said, let's get into how you can utilize dredge in Commander and how I often do when I'm building my Commander decks. And then at the very end, we'll come back around to why I think I keep ending up here. So a quick note on graveyard hate and playing against it when you're playing a dredge strategy. You want to try to set yourself up to be in a position to draw a card at instant speed as often as possible, because you can leave a dredge card in your graveyard, and then if somebody goes to use some kind of graveyard removal, a Bojuka Bog, a Ghost Vacuum, something like that, you can draw a card in response, replacing it with the dredge effect and getting that dredge card back into your hand, and then letting the ability resolve to remove your graveyard, and then just keep the process going again. Once you get the dredge card back in your graveyard, you can just keep accumulating more value in your graveyard. So that brings us to kind of the first and maybe most fair way to use dredge. It really can just be used as a self-mill strategy. So if you're running any kind of a graveyard deck, which most decks tend to run some amount of graveyard recursion because it's just such an easy way to get value out of cards, dredge can be used to fill up your graveyard with your own library and get access to most of the cards that you would want to have access to. The most common setup for this engine would be to have some kind of discard outlet in play, whether that's a Putrid Imp or Wild Mongrel, something that just lets you discard a card to get some kind of an effect. It's good if you can get some kind of a value off that discard, but it's not necessarily required. You're just trying to get the dredge card into your graveyard, and then once you have that, the systems of Magic themselves draw a card every turn. So even if you don't have a way to draw a card otherwise, you still will get the ability to draw a card at the beginning of your turn, which you can replace with the dredge effect and continue to build up your graveyard. Sticking with a sort of traditional dredge strategy, you can build upon this with more abilities that draw cards. The most powerful being ones that draw a card and then discard cards. So traditional looter effects like Merfolk Looter. If you're playing in a group that allows proxies and you're not worried about the power level, bracket 4 and up, you could play something like Bazaar of Baghdad, which draws 2 cards and then discards 3. This traditionally is a card that's played in vintage dredge decks, which is very powerful and will let you dredge through your library very quickly. If you're looking for a powered down version of that kind of effect, there's a Magus of the Bazaar, which is also quite powerful, but is a creature in play that has summoning sickness, and so there's a bit more counterplay. Ironically enough, the color red tends to work very well with dredge. It's usually because the rummaging style effects end up on red cards. You have things like Cathartic Reunion and famously Faithless Looting, which isn't rummage, it's looting, and they admitted that was a mistake and that they shouldn't have made the card that way, but look, it exists and we should play it because it's really good. So next, let's talk about a sort of less traditional value style dredge, and this revolves mostly around the card Life from the Loam, and really this is a resource engine for decks that really want to reuse lands, because Life from the Loam is just one of the best cards ever made to recur any kind of land anything. It's great for recurring fetch lands. It also works very well with the Odyssey cycling lands, which allow you to pay a mana to discard them to draw a card, which then allows you to replace it with Dredge, usually dredging back your life from the loam. Back when I was referring to the fact that you want to be able to draw a card at instant speed to avoid graveyard hate, this is exactly the plan that works well for that, is these cycle lands, life from the loam, and you can keep recurring and drawing cards and dredging your library as you're doing this. This also works really well like I said, with land value packages, and also individual lands that are quite powerful, like the spell lands from Kamigawa. Something like Boseiju or Odawara works really well with this kind of strategy, because you can just continue to recur those effects and utilize that kind of removal, sort of attrition removal against your opponents. And then finally, we would look at cards that want us to use lands in some kind of a way. Retrace is the one that immediately comes to mind, and the card 6 is very good in this scenario, in that you can basically give all of your cards in your graveyard Retrace, which allows you to discard a card and then cast them from your graveyard. If you're looking for this sort of style of dredge deck where you're dredging everything into your graveyard and you're inevitably putting things into your graveyard that you would have rather drawn, 6 is a really good inclusion, because if you reanimate 6, now everything in your graveyard can be reused with Retrace. So finally, I think we just need to mention there is a CEDH strategy that involves Dredge, but it's not the sort of traditional Dredge that you would think it is. It's really just the Gitrog monster in combination with Dakmor Salvage, which allows you to, it's a combo to just dredge your entire library immediately, because Gitrog, whenever land goes into your graveyard from anywhere, you draw a card. Instead of drawing a card, you dredge Dakmor Salvage, you discard that land card, and then you continue to just dredge and discard and dredge, and you just mill your whole deck. It's not really the kind of strategy that I'm discussing here, especially because if you're looking to build some kind of a deck that doesn't just win with an infinite combo, Dredge can just build a lot of value. It doesn't necessarily have to immediately just win you the game like it would with Gitrog and Dakmor Salvage. So, like I said, why do I keep arriving at this as a solution for most of the decks that I tend to build? Commander is a format of quality cards. So because of the singleton nature of the format and the 100 cards that are in your deck, we end up with a lack of consistency. Each individual card that you draw, if it is substantially powerful, it stands on its own. So it doesn't necessarily matter what you draw. Everything you're drawing is powerful and useful. We contrast this with sort of 60-card formats where you can play 4 copies of any individual card, and it's much easier to put together synergies. Now, Commander has one exception, which is your Commander. There are only so many play patterns that Commanders can enable. And also, if you build around your Commander exclusively, you end up in a situation where if for some reason it's not in play, then your deck just doesn't function. Players rely upon quality cards, which are cards that are individually powerful, to lead them to an inevitable win condition. This topic has kind of been being brought up a little bit by Command Zone and Trinket Mage, talking about how certain types of strategies in Commander have enough redundancy now that you can just sort of have as much consistency as a 60-card deck might. The thing that is not necessarily being talked about here is particular play patterns that emerge because of this lack of consistency, which seems very counterintuitive, right? You're thinking, okay, well, play patterns shouldn't emerge because the format is diverse and random enough that it's difficult to put those cards together. Usually play patterns emerge from combinations of 2 cards that create some kind of interesting interaction. The problem is that when you have such a high amount of inconsistency, that the types of strategies that do have the consistency end up being the ones that take over, right? So things like aristocrats, blink style decks, these these cards have had a lot of saturation throughout Magic's history, and so we see those types of strategies over and over and over again because there's such a critical mass of those cards that those strategies are easy to pull off, and their combinations together to give us that sort of synergy work really well together. Dredge does not quite work like those other strategies do. It is a quantity strategy, though, because in order for you to start your Dredge game plan, you just need one card that has Dredge on it. And then you recur it over and over and over again, drawing cards, dredging more, which then gets you further into more Dredge cards. There's a particular interaction that I think I forgot to mention earlier, which is that if you play an effect that says something like draw 3 cards, and you only have one Dredger in your graveyard, the first card that you would draw, you replace it with the Dredge effect. Let's say it's Golgari Grave Troll. You dredge 6. Within those 6 cards, you dredge a Stinkweed Imp. Well, guess what? Your second draw now, you can now dredge the Stinkweed Imp, even though it wasn't there when you started resolving the effect. And this is because of the sort of replacement nature of this effect. It doesn't use priority. It doesn't use the stack. It's just a replacement effect. It says, if you would draw the card, instead you dredge. And you can do that throughout, like it says draw 3. If you end up with 3 dredge cards in your graveyard as you're drawing them, you can dredge for each of those draws. You can't discard a card in between. You'd have to dredge it into another dredge, into another dredge. Unlike these other strategies that have had a lot of printed redundancy, Dredge doesn't really have that many cards. It's like 10 or something. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. But because the recursion of this effect gets you more Dredge cards, which gets, and each individual Dredge card is sort of its own engine, and because part of enabling that engine is just within the structures of a turn, which is just draw a card, this is why I think I keep ending up at Dredge as being one of the best value engines in all of Commander. Okay, so one thing of note too with Dredge is that it is highly susceptible to graveyard hate, right? So if your opponents are playing something like a Rest in Peace and that thing comes into play and resolves, your Dredge game plan is done. So you do kind of want to build in a secondary win condition or a way for you to continue to play the game. I don't know if it's worth it to sort of include cards to counterplay the counterplay, right? You don't necessarily want to like waste slots in your deck on combating things like graveyard hate. And most of the graveyard hate that people play, you can just dredge through it. Like Bojuka Bog once, who cares? Ghost Vacuum. I just played a game of Commander not that long ago with my Sidisi deck and just overvalued a Ghost Vacuum easily. So really the biggest one is Rest in Peace, Leyland of the Void, things like that. Commander players don't tend to play those. I think part of the reason why is they don't want to completely ruin somebody's day who's playing kind of a fair graveyard strategy. So keep that in mind as you're building these decks and utilizing this particular strategy, that if you are playing in those lower bracket games, you can still do this, but maybe don't like play a Bazaar of Baghdad, right? Like that's probably not a good idea. Even though it's not a game changer. Non-game changer. Bazaar of Baghdad. That's about all I had to say about Dredge. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. While you're down there, give us a like and a subscribe. And also, if you'd like to continue the conversation, you can join the Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.